Oh, Brent here with an anime primer on what I call the ancient era of anime. This is the period right after Astro Boy through the 60s and the 70s. And this is an interesting time for anime because Astro Boy really blew off the doors for Japanese animation. It showed that Japanese animation could be popular and profitable, or at least bring in money. And so that, of course, inspired lots of folks to copy it and make their own shows. Of course, Giganto came out the first year, so that had the giant robot stuff started spinning up from that. And because everyone was copying Tezuka's style at that point, that Japanese animation style solidified into what we now call anime. It became this specific style. So now Astro Boy was definitely aimed more at kids, so the stuff that came after it was still aimed at kids, and the stuff throughout the 60s and 70s were still generally oriented at, or aimed at preteens, tweens, sometimes younger teens. But really usually the kid market, things like Captain Tsubasa, which was a soccer show, kids dealing with kid problems. Doraemon's a perfect example. Doraemon is about this robot cat that comes from outer space and ends up living with a Japanese boy. Boy's a preteen, aimed at preteens, very colorful, very simple, but a lot of fun. You know, just a very simple, good show. Doraemon's still showing on Japanese television. They're still making new Doraemon episodes. That's how big and popular the show is. And it's consistently in like the top 3 most popular anime on Japanese television. So big stuff there. But it's sort of a classic anime from this age, especially in terms of what kind of stuff it does. Now, Doraemon's also a good example of the anime protagonist age theorem, which states that usually the age of an anime's protagonist is the same as the age of the target audience of that show. So if the main character is 15, usually the show's aimed at 15-year-olds. Now, there are certainly exceptions, no question, but it's a good, solid rule. And you see that in shows like Doraemon and Captain Tsubasa and such. And there are other shows that came out at this time that weren't quite as light and frothy kid fare as something like Captain Tsubasa or Doraemon, especially the stuff of Leiji Matsumoto. Now, he was the creator of Galaxy Express 999, Space Battleship Yamato, Captain Harlock, those shows, which are more serious space opera. There's some death. There's, the extinction of humanity, possibly in some cases. There's some very dark stuff in some of his shows. And so they're obviously aimed at a slightly older market, but also just they started bringing in some of that more gritty stuff that you'd see in later anime. Go Nagai was also big, especially in the 70s. He made Cutie Honey, which was the magical girl show with the first new transformation sequence in that genre. Good for you. As well as Getter Robo and Mazinger, which were some of the first, well, they were actually some of the first giant robot series where the pilots are actually inside the mecha. In like Gigantor and such, the mecha are basically automata, and there's someone controlling it from the side. With like Mazinger, a pilot actually has to dock inside it to pilot it. And that really changed things for mecha. It made giant robots more essentially external shells of the pilot, which allowed it to evolve in important ways later. But also, like Getter Robo and Mazinger have blood, they have violence, some nudity here and there, obviously aimed at an older crowd, more of a teenager crowd, while still being goofy and lighthearted. Speaking of goofy and lighthearted, I've got to mention Lupin III. Now, this was Lupin's a gentleman thief. He has some friends. They go on adventures, all that kind of good stuff. Lupin's a classic anime character in Japan. And, I mean, even outside of the anime industry, everyone in Japan knows who Lupin is. He's like Mickey Mouse. He's just well known. And Lupin was one of the first characters to become one of the sort of cultural icons coming out of manga and anime. Also, the director of the Lupin TV series at the time was Hayao Miyazaki, who would later go on to become very influential later on. But most of the anime of this era was still definitely light, still very episodic. I mean, there would be an arc overall, but each episode would be sort of a pretty self-contained story. until 1979 and a little show called Mobile Suit Gundam. And Gundam really changed things a lot. And I consider Mobile Suit Gundam to be very much an inflection point in anime history. For one thing, Mobile Suit Gundam is basically a 20-hour story chopped up into half-hour episodes. It's very much a just this very large stories. Characters evolve, characters change, big things happen in the plot. Now there are certainly plot issues, but Gundam introduced this idea of approaching an anime story as just one big plot. It also is more realistic, more serious. Characters die fairly frequently. Also, the mecha in Mobile Suit Gundam are war machines. They are just like fighter jets. Special in a lot of ways, but they weren't just like Mazinger, which is this crazy scientist built this giant robot kind of out of nothing, out of nowhere, and just has it sitting there, and it fights these other giant robots. The Gundam is a prototype tank basically, so that sort of changed things. And Mobile Suit Gundam really galvanized the anime fandom and a lot of anime fans. The studio Gainax, which would later become very, very big in anime, they actually credit Mobile Suit Gundam as being the thing that really inspired them to start an animation studio. And there's a lot of anime creators who will point back at Mobile Suit Gundam as being what really got them into, or really inspired them to do anime, kind of as a living and such, and sort of showed them what could be done with anime. So that's really what the ancient era looked like. Throughout the 60s and 70s, a lot of these kids shows, some little pockets of things more dramatic, more serious, more bloody, whatever. And then along came Mobile Suit Gundam, which would really end up changing things significantly, or certainly being that point at which things started to seriously shift in another direction, which I will talk about in the next segment of the Anime Primer series. See you then.